But basically, who here works with CSS a lot? Cool. And who's actually been using some sort of form of CSS preprocessor? Okay, cool. And who's using less? Cool. Anyone else already using Sass? Cool. So I'm starting to see the shift go that way, whereas like 6 months ago, somebody actually did a talk, I think Sandra gave a talk in about less in March, and there was a few people new to it then, but I feel like it's kind of like the jQuery of the CSS world, whereas like there was a few different ways of doing big libraries before, but now like with sort of CSS preprocessors, like Sass came out first, it looked a bit funny, and then people looked at less, and then they're going sort of Sass change, and then it's coming back to that. And then the other one that's fairly big, and I keep looking at because it does look really good, is Stylus, but I'm just going to cover these today. So if you're not using a CSS preprocessor yet, I'm kind of saying you should probably, and if the only argument I'm going to give you is that. If anyone knows Andy Clark, a few years ago he said he didn't have a reason to use Sass or any sort of preprocessor, and then I think late last year he said that on Twitter. So people are sort of starting to get a bit more used to it. They're getting a bit more feature complete. So in terms of less, and this is some of the reasons that I started using it, less has always looked closer to actual CSS, and that's kind of what its deal is. It looks easier for designers because of it looking closer to CSS. They originally had like a lot nicer looking website. They still do, and Twitter Bootstrap was using that. So I think a lot of people were like, "Oh yeah, Bootstrap is using less." It's the first time they might have come across it, so they started using it then. And then people like Andy Clark or other sort of well-known web designers that are talking about it, they were starting to use it and saying, "Oh, I prefer this better." And then why wouldn't people use Sass in the beginning? Well, it didn't look like CSS, so it actually got rid of all the brackets and things, and so you couldn't exactly just change the file name and still use CSS. You had to change it a bit. Some people really like this, and I one day wouldn't mind going to this, but it does work as everyone's transitioning into that sort of thing to just use normal syntax. Because it is a lot more complex as well, but also because the site is pretty badly designed, the documentation doesn't look great, and it's a bit hard to navigate. And so yeah, their website isn't as appealing as well, but they are working on a redesign. So. Yeah, they said that 10 months ago. Well, they got the logo. That's about all they've got so far. And yeah, and then the other thing, like, Andy Clark uses less, I should use that. But he was wrong. Again, like he was. So, why should you use Sass? And like, sort of what it generally looks like. It can look more like CSS now, so instead of using .sass, you can use .scss. So you just change .css to .scss, and it'll work exactly the same as your CSS. There's a lot more people working on Sass and a lot more development happening around it. Generally, that's the idea of, on paper, why it looks good. There is more features, and it does have more flexibility in what you can do with it. And then you can have massive arguments with people about why it's better than less, which seems to be popular on the internet. So just quickly, what's similar to it? Mix-ins. I mean, I'm not even showing the output of code because I did this till like 2 in the morning, but that's basically mix-in in terms of you can, in less, it's just using, looks kind of like a class, but it's actually giving you variables and things, and then you can actually call on that from within an actual selector. And then it basically just outputs whatever that code is in that mix-in, it outputs it down in that generic error one. And then the same thing in SCSS or Sass is very similar, except for it says at mix-in. I kind of like that syntax better in terms of you actually know what you're doing and then you're actually going and including it later. But it's basically the same concepts you can use. I'll kind of show you what some of this stuff could be used for in the end, so it makes a bit more sense, but it's just meant to be a short talk. Variables are really useful. You can do things like that. In less, it's just using the @ symbol, and then with Sass, very similar about using $. The advantage I find with variables in Sass, and all of this if you're using less and you can do something, I'd have used a lot of less in the past, but I'm pretty sure a lot of this stuff that I'm saying Sass is better at, less can't do. But you can actually have things like lists, so you can, this is a really simple example, but imagine you can store multiple values in one variable, then you can go use an nth function or something later on and actually pull out just one of those values. So in this output, that would actually say margin bottom 1.5m without the 1m part. And that actually gets really useful later when you start getting more complex mix-ins and things like that. Functions, they both have like some built-in functions like color functions like darken and lighten, which will just output, just work with whatever that variable is in that color, make it lighter, make it darker. Also while I'm there, there's nesting, but that's like a pretty general like thing that is the first thing preprocessors do, so if you don't know that, it actually will output. Am I nesting? Actually, that's written wrong. Oh, it's not indented properly. The button should be back. But basically that will output dot button, and then underneath it'll be dot button hover. It's a bit loud. Wrong way. And yeah, so that's basically the same thing in SCSS or Sass. But they're built-in functions with less and Sass, but with Sass you can actually create your own functions. So similar construct with as the at media, but I mean sorry, at extend, keep getting mixed in, at mixin. But yeah, you can use at function, create whatever you want, so any sort of math thing, and then you can reuse it later, so it takes in variables and then we'll just output the value right there, and you can actually get quite complicated with functions and things as well. But that's a basic example. At media, why did it do that? So you can do at media bubbling with less, which basically means including all the, this is really good for responsive design because it means you can include all your media queries within a single class, and then it'll actually output them sort of separately, so it'll do dot header, that style, and then it'll be, and open the actual media query, then do dot header again, but you don't have to keep repeating yourself. Sass does basically the same thing if you'd write it like that, but in the Sass 3.2 they actually allow you to do, they have an at content sort of thing that you can do with actually creating mix-ins. You can make it look a lot simpler, so that's actually, you don't have to remember how much, like what your sizes or your different breakpoints are, or you can do really simple things, and there's just, there's all these like way easier ways to just write, once you get your setup, to actually start writing and just write really fast. Alright, now they're the similarities and how things that they both have similar, but Sass is a little bit better. These things are generally not at all in less. So conditionals. Less has this kind of weird sort of, what is it called? This mix-in thing where it can kind of do this when stuff, but it's not exactly the same as programming. They're trying to stick to CSS syntax and it kind of feels weird and looks weird, whereas I prefer just going straight to what people are used to if they already are doing programming. So if else, it all sort of works. Really useful. So there's an example of a mix-in with then using the conditional to actually output. So that was that breakpoint mix-in before. So it's bringing that value in and then outputting it wherever you need it. and it's also using the list there to do min width or min and max width if you have two values. I don't actually use that mix-in, but that was a simpler way of putting it. Loops are really cool. So this is one example of, I did fix that, yeah. So if you're trying to output, starting to work in more of a SMAX, if you've heard of that mentality, modular sort of CSS way, that's one example with doing like layout, and you can actually, that'll automatically generate 12 different class names with a different width for each one, with just 4 or 5 lines of code. And that can go into a lot of things if you need to actually start doing stuff that's a bit repetitive. I've even seen people, instead of actually putting like lcol1, they have another function that changes numbers into the word of the number, so it actually writes the word 1 in there, but it actually does it through a loop and makes it all work really fast and nice. Extends are a really big one if you're doing modular code. So doing that, basically you're just, rather than rewriting with mix-ins and duplicating the code, you're actually just moving that selector up to with the button in the output, and all you're actually adding is that background black. And then they just brought in silent selectors, so if you can actually build up a file, say, full of a bunch of different classes that you would normally use, but if you don't use them, you don't want them output. So if you say you got the clear fix thing there, it's probably not the best example, but you extend it with those two selectors, then the output either way, with that, will just be, it won't actually include the clear fix class, it'll only include the ones that you actually use, so if you don't use it, it won't output anything. And so that was, that's basically what extend does, it just puts everything sort of up where that is saying to extend to. So in that sort of conditional thing I said before, I did leave off else at the end just in case they didn't have 1 or 2 values, so you can actually have a warning if there is something else, and say give them some sort of output, and so you get a hint of what's going wrong. There's also, I think, actually probably should be an error, not a warning, but there's also a debugging output you can do as well. And then partials are another thing that's really useful for modularizing your code. So basically, you can actually start including things separately. So the file names I've got up there, if you put an underscore in front of the file name, when you're actually processing that folder, it won't process those files directly, but if you import it, then you can import it in your main file. So I actually have a big folder structure in my main projects of like modules, and then I have every time I need a new component, I'm creating that in a separate partial file, and it's only like a small chunk of code, or it could be a little bit, but then I'm importing it all in one big style thing. And it just keeps everything separate, but also only outputs one CSS file, so it's really useful for that. I don't even know what's next. Oh, Compass. So Compass is a framework sort of thing built on top of Sass, and it allows a bunch of things like, it's not is it a framework? I don't know what to call it. It is? Yeah. Basically, like the basic things of it, it allows you to do CSS mix-in, so you can pretty much don't have to think about prefixes. As long as you're keeping Compass updated, you can just, write things like @transition, put in your variables, @include transition, instead of just saying transition, and then you can put it in once, you don't have to write any of the prefixes, it'll figure it all out for you. Things like that, pretty much most of the CSS3 is in there. I use the typography stuff a bit, where you can actually set a vertical rhythm height, and then it's got little functions and mix-ins you can use to keep the vertical rhythm throughout your whole site. And especially with doing responsive design, I tend to pretty much hardly ever use pixels anymore, so generally either using Ms or Rems. It really helps with figuring that all out and getting the measurements all right. You can have inline images. It'll give you like base 64 images inline if you need them, and it also add cache, like the little string things on the end of images, so when you reload you don't have to go and separately reload that image. You'll just actually change the when you change the image, it'll change the actual file extension thing of the image. I don't use this too much because I do a lot of like icon fonts and different things, but when you need it, I'm on a couple of projects I've used it, and it's really awesome. You don't even have to, you can actually save all your PNG files and sprites separately, have them in a folder, then just do this, like, there's a couple of functions and mix-ins you can use. Basically, it'll merge them all together, create the sprite for you, put in all the background positioning, all automatically. And that is pretty cool. And then there's a bunch of extensions that are really useful. So the breakpoint, you would have seen my breakpoint mix-in before, which is really basic. There's a breakpoint extension that actually goes into way more detail. You can do what sort of media it is. You can sort of set a bunch of variables. It's got a no query variable thing, so you can say if it's, I output this for this size, but also for like basically saying like old IE and stuff like that. So I use that one, it's really useful. RGBA background, I don't hear the people talk about this much, but I actually use it quite a lot. There's times when, especially for like IE8, you just quickly want to say, oh, I want this background. Like it's fine to do opacity in IE, but then you're trying to do the RGBA colors in like a background of something like 50%, rather than have to go and create the fallback PNG. You just say include RGBA background and put in like, you know, a 50% transparent black. It'll go and generate a PNG, a 1 pixel PNG file that'll actually just put it into the background for you. That's really useful. Singularity grid system. If you've ever seen like Gridset app, they've started using a bit of stuff, very similar sort of things to that. You can do really complex grid structures, especially with responsive design, where you can actually go in and say, I want a grid that's like, you know, well, however many measurements, but like 2 wide, then 3, and then 6, and then you can sort of have these really different shaped grids sort of thing, and you can even, it has like modular scale type stuff in it, and like all that sort of thing. There's like a whole, the whole CSS3 animations is a whole like extension that's basically gives you a lot of that sort of stuff, but in terms of, there's a guy that built a whole CSS library, and then this is based basically off that, and allows you to do a lot of really quick ways of just doing animations without having to go and figure out where everything should go. It's just like really nice way of doing that. And so if you had, I know Bootstrap actually you can use on, that has a Compass Sass version now as well, but then a similar sort of framework type thing is Foundation. I don't ever really fully use those sort of things, but they are really good to go in and have a look at, see the bits and pieces that you can sort of use, and that's where I sort of saw that looping for like columns and things like that. They're using that in there. Yeah, and there's lots of extensions. You just go looking on the website, there's heaps of places. So getting started with it, I think a lot of people sort of think Sass is a little bit harder because less was originally like JavaScript stuff. It was seemed a bit easier, but really you shouldn't be using it all like in live embedded anyway. But you don't have to use a command line, but if you do, it's really simple in terms of just doing gem install or sudo gem install. And those two things is basically you could get a project up and going with those 4 lines, sort of, technically. But yeah, the other option is there's all these GUIs that you could use. I've used Compass and CodeKit. Haven't used Live Reload or Scout, but they're pretty easy to use. I sort of go back and forth between if it's useful. But they're really easy in terms of you can like, I think CodeKit's probably the best if you do have a Mac. It does all different languages. It does do less and it does do all those other ones, plus it does all this JavaScript stuff, but it has live reload, so you can just be sitting there saving, automatically reload your page, and makes it really fast to do it. So the reasons I mainly use Sass is since I've switching from less, it's like made it really easy to modularize my code. It's made it really reusable. So it's not only like the actual partials that you're reusing in modules and things like that with CSS, but the functions and the mix-ins, you can go in and start using them, and then if you're working with other developers, like you can sort of create mix-ins and functions that everybody can use and be like, okay, we all just want to, this is how we want to output this, so we'll create a silent selector or a mix-in or a function that this is all you need to do, and you start documenting those sort of things. It makes it really good to have very sort of structured code. With the responsive designer, like, it's just ridiculously easy with it. There's so much more stuff you could start doing once you get into it, but I do things where I actually, rather than doing separate stuff for like trying to figure out IE stuff and fix that, I actually just have two separate style files. One's for IE8 and below, and one's for everything above. And you can kind of do all that crazy output with all these mix-ins and functions just with the responsive stuff. And then that way you don't have any bloat in your code from each one. So you don't have IE8 old stuff in your other code, and you don't have all the responsive stuff in the IE8 code. Yeah, and you can do, every time you do this, it's always good to keep adding onto it. You're not repeating yourself. And even when it starts getting, it's not a smacks talk, but modules and things, you start saving them aside, and you can reuse components. You can just, the more we can start reusing stuff, it's crazy how much we actually just start from scratch every time, where you can really just start reusing as much as possible. And just as I finished writing this last night, I was going to bed, and then I saw this on Twitter from Andy Clark. So now you can use Sass if you like that as well. So, yeah, thanks. Cool.